Starting formally, nice to see you, everybody. I do see you. And welcome to our webinar about awareness to behavioral change. And we'll explain what it is in a moment. But before we start, a few technicalities and a bit about myself. So as for the technicalities, you can note that your audio is muted, but you can actually ask questions in any time using the Q&A tab. Some of those could be answered immediately by our additional panelists. Others will wait for the Q&A session in the end, in which I'll try to address as many questions as time will allow us, and as accurately as I can, despite some of the topics, as you'll notice, will be slightly abstract, but that's the point. Sure. So jumping back a bit about myself, now that the technicalities are covered, my name is Leon and I will be guiding you through this webinar. I come from the background of development, application security, and infrastructure security penetration testing, but over time I found my passion in also not only being experienced in those subjects, but teaching those to other people and expanding the amount of knowledgeable minds we have in this field of cybersecurity, application security, and lately also awareness training. I'm currently the head of corporate training for ThriveDX Enterprise, where we address all of those and trying not to build just the knowledge itself, but actually affect how people conceive and implement it in their day-to-day life. And this is why the topic of this conversation and this webinar we'll be having is from awareness training to behavior change, because those are not the same, as you might have guessed. We'll be covering a few of things, because in order to understand how to shift from awareness to behavior change, and what does it mean, we need to touch the following aspects. We need to understand the current phase of cybersecurity, define our target audience and their needs, create a short and catchy content, reinforce learning using simulations, measure and evaluate the effectiveness of training, and if you wanted a checklist, this is done. Just a joke, but the point is that those items actually have a lot of meaning behind them. This is not going to be a checklist oriented and a do right or do wrong type of a webinar. I actually want to deep dive with you and explain every one of those topics and what stands behind them. If you're really interested in making this shift from just teaching awareness and focusing on implementing this as a behavioral trait within your organization and among your employees, we really need to go a bit beyond with each of those bullet points and actually focus on what do they mean and where do they come from. And if you make it to the end of the webinar, we actually have another gift for you. We've recently released a course aimed at how to develop and improve your awareness training program. So without giving too much spoilers ahead, this will be expecting you to the end of the webinar. So do stay tuned. And we'll start with going on through those items, focusing maybe on what is our state of cyber security. Take a moment to think, and this will be a rhetorical question about recent cybersecurity news you heard. What would be the notion? What would be your concern about cybersecurity in the world? And take a moment. You might think to yourself, if you want, you can type off the chat, but think, what is the current state of cybersecurity? Is it getting better? Is it getting worse? Would you believe me if I told you that the amount of cybersecurity incidents has decreased in this last year? Likely not. I don't think anybody who reads the recent news and subscribe to notifications about the cybersecurity risks gets any sort of confidence when I say a phrase as such. You might be familiar with this module, and cybersecurity is often described as the combination of people, processes, and technology. And the reason I'm mentioning it is because its model is important for us to understand why it is so hard for us to believe that cybersecurity risks are going down. We are talking about an increasing amount of complex technologies that keeps growing. We have more security measures. We implement them in many more places. We can have next gen and more advanced technologies constantly monitoring and blocking threats. We also have more robust processes, and we're incorporating a ton of automations. Almost everywhere, every tool comes with an integration or an automation feature or report. So we're also growing in that part. And despite what you think I might say, we actually are also doing kind of better on the aspect of people. And more organizations claim to invest in awareness training for their employees, emphasizing that this is an important topic. We also did research on our end and tried to understand what do people think about awareness training. And we ran a study, asked about 1,000 of CISOs, what do they think was the implementation of awareness training? About 90% said that it just created better awareness. 12% suggested that it strengthened the human firewall. 14% tended for the fact that it is increased the vigilance among employees, and almost all of them said that it's increased the corporate security. But despite this, we're still encountering an ever-growing amount of threats, and each risk poses a greater value of loss. So really, are those numbers enough? How come the number of incidents we experience keeps growing? And how is that each of them is more expensive than the one before? This is actually where we have a slight conflict, because when it comes to people training, and specifically to the context of awareness, complex or more is not necessarily what we're aiming for. Effective training is not necessarily more training or more complex training. There are different aspects to that. And that should be our guideline for the rest of the webinar. To reinforce this, and just before we jump in, you can consider the different policies and regulations in place that somewhat mention awareness training or even the security measures and when they should be checked. They all discuss the frequency rather than effectiveness and measurable items. And this is not necessarily why we need, and might be the reason why not all of awareness training is that successful, because we focus on the frequency, we focus on the complexity of the topics that we have, rather than the actual outcome, which is, to our belief, driving some sort of behavior change within the organization. And with that being said, and with that being pointed out, I do want to actually start with a more practical question and not just the thought exercise we did before, and ask you, before we deep dive into the different decks I've prepared for you, what is most important for you in your awareness training library? If you are currently not executing an awareness training, although you should, feel free to answer based on your presumption of what is more important. If you are running, that could be what made you choose this certain platform or this certain program that you're using. You should see a pop-up on your screen and take a moment to answer. So if you'll note the results, about 50% claim that quality and relevance of the content is what's more important to them. We have a few votes for quantity, variety, and customizability, and we'll be discussing all of those. But really, it's the quality and relevance, and not just among this poll, but in general feedback that we see through the different partners we're working with and the different consumers of awareness training, that we want to have quality and relevant content. But what does quality really mean? And this is when we can take a look about how behavior change actually plays a role in our definition of quality. So there are a few key things that we can do to improve our awareness training and make it something that is part of the life cycle of the organization. The first step actually does not come from the area of awareness or cybersecurity. It comes from the place of training, and it's applicable to every type of training that you do, or not even training. If you had to pitch an idea to a friend or your CEO, would you do it in the same way? Probably no. If you had to pitch an idea to the CEO, you would need to explain it briefly. It doesn't have a lot of time. You'll have to explain the outcomes, how it affects the business, what would be the cost. Whereas if you were to explain it to a friend, you could indulge in more details, try to convince him, win him over, or really open it up for debate. And the audience of your conversation plays this significant role in awareness training as well, if not more than in any other topic. Because just as in most training, trainings, identifying your target audience actually plays a significant role into determining not just what are you going to teach, but how. What do you do when you buy a pair of headphones, a vacuum, or a fridge? Will a pair of headphones will be enough, or will you search for something more? The answer, obviously, again, it depends. And some of you may search for the best budget. Some of you may buy the one that in the nearest shop. Some may search for the best in its category. And this is where things get complicated, because if we can't have an obvious answer for such simple things such as consuming a vacuum cleaner or a fridge, how can we decide what fits for more complex training such as awareness? How can we choose among all those vital topics that we need to decide to put on our training or not? Being in the current century that we're in and having all this conversation about AI, I decided to ask AI. And AI pretty much gave me a solid answer that if I want to create the best training to fill all employees in every possible case, it would not be possible. And if you try asking a similar question yourself, which could be a fun thing to do, you'll notice that most of the answers on that topic would be, it depends, or there are several factors to include in your calculation. And that would just show that we have AI on our side. And with that being said, what are next steps? So we said understanding audience is the key, and how do we do it? We do it by identifying the specific preferences and roles. What are departments do we have? What are the teams? And what are the characteristics that define our target audience? Who are our employees? What they are doing? And how can I address this within the training? Identifying what the employees are doing is not micromanagement in our case. It's trying to understand what are the processes that we need to address first and foremost. This information will usually reside somewhere between the roles, the responsibilities, and the risk that those employees are open to. If we want to drive a behavioral change, we need to achieve some influence into how awareness is perceived. And when we're trying to achieve influence, confrontation is probably the dullest tool that we can use for that purpose. And actually starting by aligning with the processes that the organization is already carrying in and saying, where are the risks in those processes? What are the roles that needs training more? And how can I tie the training to the responsibilities that the people have might actually be much more beneficial. And the organization that you work for might have a different set of roles, a different set of responsibilities that require different training approaches, even if we're talking about the same topics. If, for example, we take an IT department, they could have a need for a deeper understanding of certain threats, such as ransomware, more than your marketing needs. But at the same time, we might have the HR department who poses a greater risk simply because they communicate and interact more with external parties and might be open to receiving more malware through convenient channels in your organization. And for example, your organization utilizes an automated platform to submit your CV for employment. It means that you have a process through which malware or anything else could get in. And while the IT need to have more understanding of it, they might not be exposed. The point being is that understanding what are you going to train on is really relevant only if you understand what you're doing. And only if you do that, you can make the necessary alignments and improvements to the training, which we'll continue to review. Because once you understand who your employees are and what you're doing, you can actually tackle the next point of choosing the right format. And when talking about the right format, if any of you have heard anything about education talks and how to teach people, might have encountered things such as learning styles. Or at least had to hear an assumption from somebody saying, well, your awareness training needs to have videos because videos are the best format to learn in. Unfortunately, I've not encountered any professional from the educational field that did not address this topic with criticism. So rather than addressing this as learning styles myself, I would prefer to address it as learning preferences. Learning preferences are more a real thing. But going back to training and achieving a certain phase of efficiency, there are some more, let's call them research validated things about how people learn. Actually, people do learn better if they're exposed to information using multiple senses, such as visual, hearing, or kinetic learning. While those are not learning styles by themselves, those I said preferences, the combination of them, having to learn it through several channels, in several scenarios, in several places, is something that is in fact reinforces learning and makes people retain the information for longer, such as that it was also been proven that if information is repeated over time, people have a better chance of remembering it for a longer period of time. So choosing a right format is not necessarily choosing a specific format. We have different formats available for us. We have videos, infographics, quizzes, interactive learning. We can do webinars, just as the one we're doing now, or we can do face-to-face training, reminders via newsletters. All those are valid formats. And choosing the right one actually means choosing a few. and engaging in regular training over time. And here, choosing the right format actually speaks of how are we going to plan the training during the period of time through which we want to conduct it. My recommendation would be not just to do one annual training and leave your employees wondering. It would be to spread it across the year using different formats for different opportunities, making some of that in ongoing conversations, bringing it in weekly reviews or maybe monthlies you have in your organization, while at the same time distributing it for them to consume in their own time whenever it's more convenient to them. And for that purpose, preference still matters. Despite the said before, preference is still important, not to take any account from that, and might really influence your first engagement. When you want to get a behavioral change from an employee, it is important to start on the right foot. And the right foot might be meeting them in their comfort zone. And in our case, we don't want to convince them to use one format or the other. We actually want to have them learn and talk about it. So for that case, we might need to take some time and check what our employees react best to. Whether if we had a campaign for using video format, we had more engagement, or if we had the time to give them an interactive training, considering whether we gave them the time to actually complete it. We'll talk about measurements a bit later on. We'll get back to this is the last bullet on our item list. But to put a note here, regardless of the format you use, what's right for you is what right for you. Focus on ensuring that your content is easily accessible on a variety of devices and a variety of platforms, allowing your employees to engage with the content whenever it's right for them, whenever it's convenient for them, might play even a greater role than adjusting the specific format you use. And all the better if you have the same training in several formats. You might choose the one relevant for the case and convey the same content once as a video and once just as a poster that you hang around the office. And this comes back to the concept of having information both repeated and taught in several structures in several scenarios. If they encounter the same information, not just in their closed box while they're doing the training, but they also encounter it in the office, in regular conversations. If somebody mentions awareness in the daily meeting with the developers or in the weekly review with the sales team, you build a culture where awareness is not discussed as something you need to do and get done, but rather something that is part of the ongoing conversation. And this is really what behavior change is about. It is important to note from this point going forward that it's not only just about choosing the format, but also how you structure that format and how does your content look by itself. If format is not really what's important, and if we need to have some formats for some of the training, not all of them, what does matter? There are a few aspects aside from repetition and accessibility that make training engaging and is more likely to make the training stick with your employees. The way we can make training stick is by, first of all, avoiding information overload. In the current era, we have information coming from all sorts of places in all sorts of formats and quantities beyond your imagination. And this is what allows us to actually train AI. But it is too much for us as humans to comprehend. especially when we're trying to engage in learning. When trying to learn, providing too much information has been proven to reduce the amount of things that actually stick with you. And it doesn't mean that we need to compromise on the necessary knowledge, but instead it emphasizes that we need to prioritize what's more relevant for us, what's most relevant for us to build a strong cybersecurity resilience in our workforce, and prioritize this information first. Also, make sure that it aligns with our business needs. An example I'd like to use is how do you use training about using devices such as disk on keys? Do they really pose a risk? And in one of my discussions, a friend said, no, they're not. And another one, a friend says, yes, obviously they are. The first one explained it by saying that nobody uses disk on keys anymore. They are redundant as most of the information is in the cloud. While the other one said, well, we don't only use disk on keys, we use keyboards, we use headphones which connect through a USB and might also pose a risk. And this is where your organizations and business needs might play a role. Because while this topic is arguably important or not, you decide, you can also say how important it is. If, for example, your organization has a security control that prevents all USB devices unless ones that were whitelisted, it will necessarily be less important than addressing phishing, which might be something your employees receive all the time. And this prioritization between the information overload will allow you to focus on training that is really important to your employees. And if it's important to them, they will adopt and discuss it more rather than training they feel distant from. There is another aspect to that, which is slightly more creative, and we'll make a short shift to the visuals and graphics. This is also something that is proven to take a toll on how people perceive content. And this is a practical tool that you can incorporate into your training. We talked about having training delivered on several types of media, but also if we chose just to have a video or we choose to have a poster, combining a striking visual with strong voiceover might deliver a more effective message than just a monotonic description of the training that you're using. So maybe even if you chose the training format that you want to do and you chose the topics that you want to address, focusing your next step on how to make this content more dominant, more attracting is the thing for you. Another story about a while back, a friend actually sent me a meme about cybersecurity. She knew nothing about password complexity or anything related to that. Which I obviously taught her about. But the fact was that she did send me something about password security, just because she found it funny. And this is an important note. People usually share things that they find interesting or appealing, and graphical language and strong visuals also have an important case there. So we said we want to focus on behavior change, not only on awareness, because in the long term, this is something that I might have not said, but it's important to point out, lead to one another. In the long term, behavioral change does result in awareness. And behavior change might start just by sharing something that you found nice, something that you found interesting, and not necessarily something that created the most, that provided you the most of information. And for that sake, it's important to note that we keep things simple and prioritize the key message, unavoiding the necessary information. And this is how, furthermore, we can avoid the information overload mentioned before. We can stop using complex jargon and not fall into any barriers that result from people not understanding what we're trying to convey. Cybersecurity is as complex as it comes whenever you try to understand the different shortcuts that we have for different complex terms. You can have an entire conversation talking about DNS, ARP, SSH, and those, for some of us, will sound just like a combination of words that you couldn't find in the dictionary, so you made one up. And this is where trying and keep the message simple also benefits us in order to make it part of the day-to-day. Awareness training is something that is intended for everybody, not just the technical people. And they might find it hard to talk about it or consult about it if it's a language that they don't understand. And how do you do even more? How do you bring a topic that is complex into the simpler plane? You joke about it. You introduce humor. And humor is often debatable. Some will like it more, some will like it less, some will say that humor depends, and others will say humor is not relevant for training. And I can agree with that, but the reminder, we're not doing just training, we're doing change. And part of this change is meeting employees in a comfort zone. Having meet them with a smile, with a humor, something that they can laugh about, will leave them thinking about the topic. It might make them share this, just as my friend shared password security with me. And it might make them your means to deliver the content for other people that struggled with the training on their own, because after the training was conducted, suddenly a conversation emerged within your employees based on a meme that somebody decided to share. And while not all of the content needs to be simple, not all the content have to be humorous, I would emphasize to address it the 5 seconds of the training. The reason I say 5 seconds is because of the time it takes to take a first impression. Awareness training, as any person we meet, have about 5 seconds to make an impression of how learners are going to perceive it. If you have any control of your customization abilities within the system, pay a close note to that. Pay a close note on how the training starts, how it welcomes the user, whether it explains what's going to be or not. Because if starting the training, the employee is not going to understand what it will be about or what is expected from him or how it is relevant to the work he is doing, he is much less likely to continue or engage with the training the more he goes into it. And the more he goes into it, there is an expectation that training will become more complex and more parts. And this is something to keep in mind while you design the training. You need to build the knowledge based on things your users are familiar with. Make sure that you build the foundation for the awareness training. And this means putting things into perspective that is relevant to them. If, for example, you need to teach them about ransomware, start in general, explaining what malware is or how they might receive it. If you want to explain password security, don't deep dive just into what a strong password is or how to store it. Explain to them how it is relevant to them and how a strong password might affect them. It relates to another technical term called the zone of proximal development, which is just a module to keep in mind, but it talks about how easily people perceive new information that is being presented to them. If this information is something that they're familiar with, they're more likely to perceive it and be able to cope with it independently. If it's something that they're more distant from, it is less likely for them to be able to comprehend it, and they might require some assistance. And if it's really far from them, if it's something they're not familiar with, has not encountered, but suddenly has to do in the scope of some regulation, they will not remember it. And there is nothing we can do to make them unless we address first things that they're familiar with. For example, if I had to explain to any of you how an engine works, you will likely say you don't need it because you can drive a car without it. But if your car engine stops in the middle of the road and you need to address it, it becomes much more relevant, and suddenly you feel that you know the knowledge. And putting that into context, explaining where you might need this knowledge and where you will encounter it, and using analogies to explain it better can put a lot of ease in how employees perceive that and build this information going forward. There is another aspect I want to add to that, and this is the role of attack simulations. What do you think when I say training without practice? It suddenly sounds dull. When we were discussing training before, it was all good, but suddenly we say training without, and we experience an issue. Now there is something missing. In awareness training, this is the role of attack simulations. Going back to the analogy of the car I used, you don't really learn how to drive a car in theory. You have to get into the car and you have to experience the road. You need to understand how to react to different things you can only experience once you're in the car. And training is very similar to that. If you only practice in theory and you don't experience it, a lot of the information is lost. You don't really develop a behavior, you develop an understanding. Because if you put training only in the context of the training and not in the context of checking your mailbox, you are more likely to fall for an attack. By conducting those simulated trainings, you are more likely to make the employees associate this secure behavior with the actions that they are doing, and in such result with a more effective training. And even if they counter-report emails that are turned to be actual emails and not phishing, this is actually a benefit because they practice the act of reporting. They practice communicating it. And even if they do and miss a few, it does solve our objective of getting them to be more proactive, to getting them more involved in the awareness of their organization, and most importantly, practicing it where they experience it, whether on their computer, in their mailbox, or at home, if we're talking about how to secure your workplace when working remotely. A note on that is that training also suffers from the same faults that simulations. And when running simulations, all the points I pointed out before still do apply. And it's not about just sending an email, but rather teaching employees how to recognize the different cues that might suggest a phishing, such as an email being out of context or offering them an unrealistic offer, which should make them second guess why they're getting it. And it's about developing the behavior of how to react. It's not about not clicking that specific link in a phishing email. It's about understanding that links pose a danger in general and that you should instead go to the site yourself. The best way to achieve it is to engage with the same tools that you do with training. And if we said that training should be customized and adjusted to the needs of your organization, it's important to do the same with the simulations. Make sure that the simulations are relevant, make sure that the simulations are timely, and make sure that the simulations do not stand on their own, but rather than revise, reference, and explain, creating a nurturing and a safe environment for your employees to feel free about communicating about it, about talking, and not just experience it and feeling that they fell for a phishing campaign. I think that the last topic we needed to discuss is, so with that being said, how do we measure it? We engage with the tools, we made the training, what we presume to be relevant, we customized whatever we needed, we made it funny, we chose the formats. How are we going to measure it? And actually, not just how, but what we're going to measure. When it comes to measuring, there are a few things that are rather simple to measure, and those are numbers. Numbers such as how many people completed the training, how many people clicked on the phishing campaign, or what was the quiz score. Those are not relevant if you want to create a behavioral change within the organization. If you want to get a number, if you want a statistic to show in a meeting, yes, those are measures. But if we want to drive a change, there are other things that you should measure. You should measure the feedback, not a numeric, but a textual feedback of how engaging was the training. Did you enjoy learning this topic, or did you think it's not relevant to you? You can measure engagement. How much of the conversation is starting from the employee? Do they ask questions about it? Do they pay any interest in learning more? And finally, the behavior change itself. Whether there is more reporting on phishing topics, whether there is more concern, whether users just confirm with you whether the file they received is safe or not. And this redefinition of what you measure with a continuous evaluation and revision of your content, it's what will make you thrive in that field. If you measure the right things, if you indulge in this improvement of not just how many people click, it might be that they don't click because they're simply are not interested in the offer, and they will for a real one. They might be completing it, but only scrolling through, not really learning the topics, or they might get a high quiz score because they Googled answers online. This is not what we're trying to achieve. We're trying to have them believe that their awareness is part of their work, is part of what drives their business, and that the business cares not just about them scoring, but really cares about them implementing it going forward. So a short recap, because we did discuss quite a bunch of things. Relevant and engaging training, perhaps quality training, according to our definition, is what really drives a behavior change. Because when we focus on relevancy and when we focus on quality rather than numbers, we focus on change. Having different formats of content available and accessible, relevant and customized to your employees will have a great effect on how they perceive the training, whether they feel that they have to do it, or whether they feel that it's relevant and they want to do it because there's a greater good in it. Utilizing simulations plays a huge role in reinforcing because it brings the learning into the day-to-day. They experience it, not just learn it. And by this becoming learning through experience, you gain one more medium, which plays a stronger role in reinforcing this knowledge in their heads. And lastly, measuring the effectiveness of your training rather than pure numbers will definitely make your training better, and employees as well. And those are in a high level. and really just maybe the tip of the iceberg of how to make your awareness training into a behavioral change. As I said in the beginning, this is not a checklist. So if you try to do it one by one, you will likely get good results, but not great ones. If you really want great ones, if you want the behavior, you should use those as a framework and as a guideline to, am I addressing the things that I should? And hopefully you would. And with that being said, let's address some of the Q&As. And could you share a screen on how a simulated game look like? I won't jump into the platform right now because we do have a bit of short time and there are a bunch of games which you can do. There is not just one simulated game. And simulated games are slightly different than phishing simulation because phishing simulations are not games. There are emails that really mimic how an attack would look. How would a phishing email sent by us be perceived by an employee who doesn't know we send it? So in terms of phishing simulations, and just to clarify, the meaning was to simulating real-life attacks, but in a safe environment. Rather than having a link that leads to them submitting information to the attacker or download the file, which is malicious, when they click this, they're referenced to the relevant training. As far as simulated games goes, there are multiple types of games that you can incorporate and create a fun, gamified learning experience. Some of those could be classification games, classifying different threats into the relevant categories. Other ones could be identification games, giving them a context through a picture or an email or a text, and asking them whether they identify what is the risks posed by it. Another question is how to know which is the best form for training our users. How does it make sense to let the users select his own preferred form of training? One of the approach to do it is to address it through needs assessment that you conduct before you engage with the training. You can do an ad hoc survey of your users asking how do they usually learn? Whether they do it by watching videos, whether they feel that they want to do it by reading, and whether they like to learn through playing games. You can ask them if they had to learn a language, what would be their to-go-to tool, and base your initial assumption of that. But that should be it. That should be just an assumption which you later validate. You can try and experiment, and this is what you should do. Try and experiment with the different formats that you have. Perhaps take the same topic of training and deliver it once in a video, once in a written format, and once as a poster on a wall. And then you gain two benefits. One, you've utilized the multisensory approach and provided them with some repetition of the content, but also you expose them to multiple trainings, and then you can gain their feedback and ask, we did this awareness training for you. What did you like about it? What didn't you like about it? What information stuck with you? And this is really where putting in the feedback tool comes into play. The format that will suit your employees best might also change as some of the employees change, as the organization grows or shifts its focus. And this is something that you need to do regularly. So best also in this case is relative. And to try to give you a more specific answer, the best way to know what fits, what's most likely to fit best is to ask. How to validate it is by measuring it afterwards. So even if users say something like, we think that video is the best format, but you identify through engagement that whenever you send out a video, it took them more time to complete it, or rather they felt that they didn't have the time to do it, try to experiment with a different format and try to introduce micro-learning or gamified experience, and maybe they will react better. But the point being is that in order to know, you will need to first ask and then experiment and then revise over time. Another question that we have is, what would be the most compelling reason for a customer to invest in security when everything, not sure what hunky-dory is. There is no one reason, and I said there's going to be a few ambiguous answers that I give for a specific customers to invest in security, because everybody invests in security for a different reason. Some might invest in security because they have to meet a certain regulation and to be profitable. Another might choose to invest in security because he just suffered an incident and needs to make amends for it. A third might say, like, I want to invest in security because it's a core principle of my business. And that would, by the way, be the person I agree with most. Security should be just a core principle of your business, such as any other. But the point here would be not to convince him using what sounds best for you, but rather convince him for what will drive the best value for him. And this comes back to, rather than confronting him and saying, like, if your reason is money, then awareness training might be expensive, and you want to save up. But in the long term, if you purchase a product that allows for customization and sending multiple campaigns over the years rather than having a one-time off, you'll save money by having to do this using the same tool for conducting ongoing training. So you really don't provide them a compelling reason for security as a security, but you provide them with a compelling reason that ties security into what they feel they need most. This is also why I consider security to be one of the core principles of any business, because you can't tie security to everything, to how employees feel, to how they're engaged with the business, to what they discuss, and to what makes you profitable. Because obviously, if you fail in security, money would come as a payment. Regulatory requirements still pretty much shape the way how training should be conducted. In most organizations, 1% of total employees who attend, 10% who scored more than 80%. How can we shift such a mindset that you have articulated in the past 60 minutes? So those do not go into oppositions. Regulatory requirements might be what initiates the training, but what goes beyond it and how you make it more effective is what you try to apply this mindset to. If you're struggling with the regulatory requirements, if you're not meeting the numbers, then just introducing this mindset and saying, let's see if it affects. And again, most regulatory requirements will allow you to introduce some sort of measurement. So rather than saying I measure just the quiz scores, let's say we measure both the quiz score and let's measure the feedback of the user. So you introduce another factor. If let's say the regulatory requirement requires you to do the training once a year, you can incorporate the needs assessment and also do it once a year. So in that aspect, it would be like regulatory requirements, and I'm doing regulatory requirements, and I'm attaching a piece of that mindset. And another topic on that, because that actually leads me to the giveaway that I promised you. We've recently tried to contribute back, and we want to make sure that we grow in a strong security-oriented society. And part of this is sharing this knowledge. We created a program which addresses many of those aspects, address regulations defined by NIST on how to make awareness training, and tries to make it more accessible and provide you with some tips and takeaways on how you can incorporate it in your business, to try and give you some tools to conduct the same needs assessment that I mentioned. And for a limited time, we decided to give it for free simply because we want to encourage people to try and not be scared of the fact that this is a mindset and not a regulatory requirement, and try to incorporate it nonetheless. And there are a few more days left to register to the course. Well, I normally would say that scanning QR codes is not secure. This time, there's a course behind it, a very realistic offer. If you want to, scan the code, use the coupon provided on the screen, and you'll be able to enroll in the course. The course gives slightly more practical tools, which still align with the same mindset I provided. And you can take whenever you want to go through it. And there are some additional artifacts there, such as needs assessment document or more questions that you can ask, and more solid tips describing how, for example, to gather feedback, what to focus on, or showcasing different formats. If you wanted to ask what a game looks like, you'll find some of the reference information in our course. And with that, I will stay for a few more minutes, and if we have any more questions, but otherwise, guys, thank you very much for joining me. I do hope that with this some ambiguity around those topics, you did find the content useful, enjoyable, and most importantly, you have this sense to find how it will be applicable to your business. Because applying awareness training, cybersecurity as a behavior change, as not justice training, is really a mindset that I urge you to implement in order to get long-term benefits, short-term benefits, and greater cooperation with your user, employees, and colleagues. Thank you.